My dear, I never thought I'd wear white again. Not after burying my first husband. Not after the long hush of widowhood wrapped itself around my days like Spanish moss. But love, that stubborn old thing, came knocking when I was least prepared and most in need of it. He brought lilacs and laughter, promises that felt real enough to touch. And for a while, I let myself believe I was walking into a second spring. But what happened next? Well, I don't think any woman, not even one as seasoned by sorrow as me, could have seen it coming. If you enjoy stories like these, I'd be mighty grateful if you'd subscribe, give it a like, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Sometimes it helps knowing who's out there sharing the silence. Now let me take you back to where it all started. It was the kind of morning where the sun hit just right, soft and golden, filtering through Spanish lace curtains in my old Charleston home. My hands trembled slightly as I fastened the last button on my vintage tea-length dress, the one I'd had altered just for this day. 64 years old and about to marry again. Who would have thought? Downstairs, laughter floated up from the kitchen. My daughter Rachel was there. She'd flown in a week early, insisted on doing my makeup herself. "You've earned this day, Mama," she said last night, brushing my hair like she used to when she was small. "You deserve every bit of joy." I believed her. I descended the staircase, clutching a small bouquet of heirloom roses from my garden, their scent sweet and warm, mixed with the faint smell of cinnamon rolls someone had baked that morning. My heart was so full it could have burst. But when I stepped into the chapel an hour later, bouquet in hand, the world tilted. My fiancé Thomas wasn't waiting at the altar. He was in the back vestibule, his hand brushing Rachel's cheek, and something in her eyes told me she wasn't going to stop him. They say the heart remembers what the mind would rather forget. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I stumbled across the box, tucked behind an old stack of novels in the attic, wrapped in blue ribbon so delicate I nearly wept touching it. I wasn't looking for memories, I was hunting for a lamp cord. But life has a way of handing you ghosts when you're just reaching for light. Inside the box was a napkin from our rehearsal dinner, stained with red wine and laughter, a dried petal from my bouquet, and a photograph blurry off-center, of me and Rachel standing arm in arm outside the chapel. It was the last picture taken before everything changed. Muffin, my cat, curled up at my feet as I sat cross-legged on the attic floor, holding that photo like a lifeline. She purred, warm and indifferent to the storm that picture stirred in me. I hadn't seen it in years. Funny thing about pain, it doesn't rot. It dries out, grows brittle, but never quite disappears. I thought I'd buried it. The betrayal. The shame. The ache of becoming the punchline in my own love story. But time doesn't mend everything. Some wounds just settle deeper into your bones, waiting for an attic light bulb to flicker them back to life. I wish I could say I burned the box, or that I threw the photo away. But I didn't. I held on to it. Just like I held on to the memory of that day. Of the moment I stood in a chapel full of hydrangeas and heartbreak, and realized the man I was going to marry had chosen my daughter instead. Now I think I'm ready to tell the truth of what happened. Not the polite version. Not the one I offered at garden parties and Sunday suppers. The real one. Charleston in springtime has a softness to it. A kind of sigh in the air that settles on your shoulders like an old quilt. The azaleas bloom loud and showy, of course, but it's the hush between the blossoms that tells you everything's waking up again. After years of widowhood, that's how love found me, quietly, like the hush. It had been 8 years since James passed. He died slow, the kind of death that saps a little more light from a room each day. Pancreatic cancer is cruel like that. I watched the man I built a life with fade in pieces, till all that was left was the echo of his voice on our answering machine and the divot in the mattress beside me. Rachel had just moved back from Atlanta then. She was 34, freshly divorced, bitter as a lemon rind, and back under my roof with more baggage than just her 2 suitcases. We managed, her and I, like women often do when they're hurting in different directions. She got a job teaching music at the local elementary, and I threw myself into volunteering in garden club. Grief passed through us like weather. Unexpected, sometimes violent, but never permanent. And then came Thomas. He walked into the library one Tuesday afternoon, where I was organizing a fundraiser for the Historical Society. He had kind eyes. That was the first thing I noticed. That, and the way he listened, really listened, as though your words were secrets he'd promised to keep. He was a retired architect from Savannah, widowed like me, recently moved to Charleston to be near his son. Trying to start fresh, he told me. I remember the way he leaned on the counter, fiddling with his cufflink, his smile warm but not too eager. It wasn't love at first sight. It was something gentler. A kindling. He asked me to coffee that same week. I almost said no. I hadn't worn lipstick in 2 years and my dating shoes still had dust from the Bush administration. But Rachel, well, she was the one who nudged me. You deserve something that's just yours, Mama, she'd said, and for once, her eyes didn't carry that tired resentment. Go see if he's got a heartbeat. That first coffee turned into many. Bookstore dates, long walks near the Battery, Sunday brunches under live oaks. He wasn't James. He didn't try to be. Thomas had this steady presence, more anchor than sail. And before I knew it, he'd settled into my life like he'd always belonged there. Rachel seemed happy for me. She even joked with him, calling him Mr. Renaissance, because of his love for old buildings and even older jazz. They'd sit on the porch some evenings while I brought out sweet tea and watched the sun make silhouettes of them both. I told myself we were healing together, that the past was behind us. But love, my dear, love has a way of magnifying everything. Joy, fear, and the cracks you try to plaster over with polite silence. It was early autumn when Thomas proposed. We were sitting beneath the arbor in my back garden, the roses heavy with late bloom. I'd just clipped a few for the vase when he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a ring nestled inside an old velvet box that looked like it had seen 100 promises before mine. I know we're not young, he said, his voice catching slightly, but I don't think that matters when you find someone you want to sit beside in every season. My breath caught. Not because I was surprised, he'd hinted at it for weeks, but because of the way he said every season. Like he wasn't promising forever, just the parts of it that mattered most. I said yes. Of course I did. Rachel cried when I told her. She hugged me tight and whispered, "You really are brave, Mama." And for a while, it felt like the story was writing itself exactly as it should. The wedding was planned for the following spring, intimate, just family and a few dear friends. We chose a small chapel just outside town with weathered white pews and stained glass that caught the morning light like fire. I found a vintage tea-length dress with embroidered sleeves and a pale blue sash. Thomas wore navy. Simple, elegant, full of grace. But looking back, I can see it now. The shift in Rachel. It was subtle at first. She grew quieter, lingered less during our porch talks. She stayed late at work, or so she said. And when she did come home, she brought wine and conversation that felt brittle at the edges. One evening I found her in the garden, crying over something she wouldn't name. She brushed it off. "Just tired," she said, laughing through a sniffle. "Ignore me. Hormones, probably." I should have pressed her. But love makes us blind in strange ways. I wanted to believe my daughter was just adjusting, that her heart was still mending, and she was simply feeling left behind. Never, not once, did I imagine she and Thomas might have shared something deeper than conversation. Even now I wonder, were there signs I missed? Moments when his eyes lingered a second too long on her laugh? Times when she looked at him not like a daughter does her mother's fiancé, but like a woman does a man who's noticed her? I told myself no. Because the truth, my dear, is often the last thing we're willing to see. The week before the wedding was warm and bright, unseasonably so for April in Charleston. The kind of weather where everything feels in bloom, even if something beneath it is beginning to rot. I spent most of those days elbow-deep in final details. My friend Delilah from the garden club was helping with floral arrangements. My son Ben flew in early from Boston with his wife, bringing the grandkids and their sweet chaos. The house was full again, laughter in the hallways, jazz playing softly from the record player, something always baking in the oven. I told myself I'd never felt more whole. Rachel, though, was distant. She still smiled in all the right places, poured mimosas at brunch, even helped me steam the hem of my dress. But her smiles felt rehearsed, like a pianist hitting keys by memory without any music in her fingers. When I caught her alone, she'd snap back into brightness too quickly. "You all right, baby?" I asked her one night on the porch, just the two of us and the hum of cicadas. She nodded, eyes fixed on the moon. Just thinking, she said. It's a lot, isn't it? Seeing you get married again. I guess it stirred some things up for me. I reached for her hand. You miss Jacob? Her ex-husband had been a quiet presence, kind but emotionally slippery. He'd left her with nothing but a car payment and a nervous laugh. Rachel looked down. Maybe. I don't know. It's not him I miss. Just the idea of being chosen, I suppose. There was a tremble in her voice I'd heard before, back when she was 12 and didn't make the middle school choir. That same sense of smallness, of feeling invisible in the room. You are chosen, I told her gently. You're my girl. Always have been. And one day, someone will see the fire in you again. Someone who knows how to hold it. She blinked hard and smiled. You always know what to say. But as she hugged me goodnight, something in her arms felt more like apology than comfort. The rehearsal dinner was held at my friend Clara's house, an old plantation-style home with a wraparound porch and wisteria that spilled like purple rain. Everyone wore pastels and practiced toasts, and I watched Thomas move through the crowd like a man at ease with life. He looked so happy laughing with Ben, helping Clara's husband open wine bottles, slipping his arm around my waist with quiet assurance. Rachel sat across from me at dinner. Her dress was pale green, her hair curled just so, and every time Thomas spoke, her eyes found him like gravity. It was subtle, so subtle. But I noticed. Just once, when he complimented the lemon cake and she laughed too loud, leaned in too close. He didn't touch her. Nothing so bold. But her hand brushed his when they passed a dish. And they didn't look away fast enough. I blinked. Told myself I imagined it. The mind plays tricks, especially when the heart is full. That night, after everyone had gone, I sat in my room and tried to shake the feeling. Told myself she was just vulnerable. Told myself Thomas was kind, not flirty. That there was no room for suspicion between a mother and daughter. But deep down, a cold knot was forming in my chest. It wasn't until the next morning, 3 days before the wedding, that the first undeniable crack showed itself. I'd gone to the chapel early with Delilah to check the altar decor. The place smelled of lilies and lemon polish, sunlight spilling across the pews like a benediction. We stayed a while, chatted with the pastor, measured where the musicians would sit. When I got back home around 10, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I found Rachel in the kitchen, barefoot, pouring herself a glass of wine before noon. Her cheeks were flushed, not with embarrassment, but something more electric. She didn't notice me at first. You're up early, I said, soft but watchful. She turned quickly. Oh yeah, couldn't sleep. Where's Thomas? She hesitated. He dropped by, just to drop off the music list. I blinked. He was here. Yeah, she said too quickly. Didn't stay long. I looked at the counter. No note. No list. She turned her back to me and started rinsing the glass. Rachel, I began. She didn't turn. Just said, don't. That one word, don't. It landed like a slap I didn't know I'd earned. I wanted to press her. Ask what she meant. Ask what was really going on beneath her skin. But I didn't. Instead, I walked upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed. Bouquet mock-up still in my hand. The roses suddenly looked too red, too fresh, too optimistic. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, the way a storm telegraphs itself to old joints and aching hearts. But I wasn't ready to see the truth. Not yet. Because when you're standing in the glow of what you think is love, my dear, you'll squint at every shadow until it disappears. The day before the wedding was a kind of calm that felt unnatural. The sky hung too blue, the birds too cheerful, like the world had missed a cue and was playing the wrong mood. Ben took the kids to the beach for the afternoon. Clara came over to help me finalize seating charts and tie lavender sprigs to the napkins. Every hour felt like its own pocket of breath, held tight, waiting to exhale. Thomas stopped by around 3 with a fresh-pressed shirt for the ceremony and a kiss for my cheek. He looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept, but he smiled all the same. I'll see you tomorrow, darling, he said, holding my hand a second longer than usual. Big day. I nodded, a flutter in my chest that had nothing to do with nerves. Rachel wasn't home. She'd left early, claiming last-minute errands and a salon appointment. No one thought it strange. She was the maid of honor, after all. but my stomach turned each time my phone didn't buzz with a message from her. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror in my robe, looking at myself the way you do when you're about to be a bride again. The lines around my mouth, the soft map of veins in my hands. I wasn't young, but I was still a woman, still capable of hope. Still someone who believed that love, when it comes again, might stay this time. Mama! Rachel's voice drifted through the door like a song forgotten mid-verse. I turned. She stood there in her nightgown, mascara slightly smudged, hair still damp from a shower. Her eyes looked tired, haunted even. I smiled gently. You all right, baby? She nodded, but it was the kind of nod people give when their mouth knows the truth would break everything. She came over and helped me pin back my hair. Her fingers trembled slightly. You look beautiful, she whispered. So do you, I said, watching her reflection more than my own. We stood there a long moment, just the two of us. No music, no words. And then she asked quietly, Are you sure? I turned to face her. Sure about what? Her eyes searched mine with such desperation I felt my knees wobble. That this is what you want, she said, voice thin. With Thomas. Are you sure? It was such an odd question. Such a sudden shift. I blinked. Rachel, what are you saying? She stepped back. Looked away. Nothing. I'm sorry. I'm just being stupid. No, you're not, I said, reaching for her hand. Tell me. She pulled away. I can't, she whispered. And then she left the room. That night I barely slept. I lay awake with the image of her face burned into my eyelids. That pleading look. That tremble in her jaw like a confession pressed against the back of her teeth. Something was clawing its way through the walls between us, and I couldn't stop it. By dawn I told myself I was imagining things. That Rachel was just emotional. That she missed her father. That she feared losing me. That this was a woman's version of cold feet, for a daughter, not a bride. But part of me knew. Part of me knew. And yet, I still put on the dress. Still tied the blue sash. Still stepped into the waiting car, heart trembling like a branch in a storm. I still believed until the very last moment that love was about to carry me home. The chapel was alive with morning light. It streamed in through the stained glass windows in swatches of rose and gold, painting the worn pine floors with colors that looked almost holy. Clara's floral arrangements lined the aisle, white hydrangeas, soft pink peonies, sprigs of lavender. The organist played something gentle and old-fashioned. Everything felt still, expectant. I stood just outside the sanctuary, bouquet in hand, veil fastened with my mother's brooch. My heart beat like a rabbit's, quick fluttering, full of both joy and something unnamed. Rachel was supposed to meet me there, to walk me down the aisle alongside Ben. But she hadn't come yet. Clara kept checking her watch. You know your daughter, she whispered, trying to smile. Always a little dramatic with the entrances. I nodded, though a coldness was beginning to bloom just beneath my collarbone. Thomas was already inside. I'd seen him earlier, dressed in navy, adjusting his cufflinks by the chapel doors. He'd smiled when he saw me, but it was tight. Tired. I chalked it up to nerves. Shall we start? The pastor asked gently. Clara touched my arm. We can wait a few more minutes. But something inside me, some quiet inner alarm, was already ringing. Just then, Delilah stepped out from the chapel vestibule, her face pale. She walked with the hesitant steps of someone trying not to be seen. Ellie, she said, voice low. Could I speak with you a moment? The room tilted. I set my bouquet on the bench beside me and followed her into the hallway. My heels echoed on the tile like tiny betrayals. What is it? I asked. What's happened? She looked at me, and her eyes filled with such pity that I nearly wept on the spot. It's Rachel, she said softly. I stared at her. What about her? She's with Thomas. In the back. With him. Delilah hesitated, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for a gentler version of the truth. I saw them, she said finally. Talking. Very close. It didn't look right. My throat dried up. I turned without another word and walked toward the back vestibule. The hallway was narrow, lined with portraits of former pastors and golden sconces that flickered with real flame. I could hear voices ahead, soft, low, urgent. I stopped just before the door and listened. I can't do this, Thomas was saying. You already are, Rachel whispered. Not like this. Not here. You told me. I know what I told you. Silence. Then Rachel's voice, tight with emotion. You don't love her. I care for her. But not the way you do me. More silence. Then a sigh. I pushed the door open. They both turned, faces flushed, caught like children with matches in their hands. Rachel stepped back. Mama. Thomas looked at me, shame rising in his eyes like floodwater. I can explain, he said. I stood there in my wedding dress, staring at the man I'd said yes to and the daughter I'd raised from cradle to career. My hands were shaking, not with rage, but with something deeper, grief sharpened to a blade. You don't need to, I said softly. Thomas reached for me. Please. I pulled away. Rachel began to cry. It just happened. I nodded slow. Of course it did. There was a bench behind me. I sat down, suddenly too tired to stand. How long? I asked. Neither answered. I looked up at Rachel. You loved him. Her lip trembled. I didn't mean to. That was the last thing she said before I stood up, smoothed the skirt of my dress, and walked out of the room. I passed Clara Delilah the pastor. I didn't say a word. I simply picked up my bouquet and exited the chapel through the side door, into the blinding Charleston sun. I walked down the gravel path, past the guests who had begun to whisper, past the children chasing bubbles on the lawn. And I kept walking. Because sometimes, my dear, silence is the only thing that keeps a heart from shattering completely. I didn't cry until I reached the edge of Colonial Lake. It's a quiet place not far from the chapel, rimmed by old oaks and lined with benches that remember more secrets than people do. I sat on the worn iron bench nearest the fountain, veil still pinned, bouquet clutched like a lifeline, and let the tears come. They weren't dramatic sobs. They were soft, steady, like rain tapping against an old roof. The kind of crying a woman does when she's no longer surprised by pain, just tired of its persistence. I watched the ducks glide across the water, oblivious to everything human. Around me joggers passed, a few curious glances thrown my way, but no one stopped. Which was just as well. I needed space, not sympathy. Sympathy would have cracked me open. I sat there a long while, thinking about every moment that had led me to that bench. The way Rachel used to crawl into bed with me when she was small, whispering about monsters under her bed. The way Thomas had brought me honey from the farmer's market that first summer, just because I mentioned I liked it in my tea. The way I had allowed myself to believe just this once that the story would end the way it does in books. But life isn't literature. It's more like jazz. Improvised, unexpected, sometimes off-key. And that morning, I'd been handed a discordant note I didn't know how to play. I should have been angry. I should have screamed, thrown my bouquet into the lake, cursed them both out loud. But what I felt was deeper than fury. It was the death of a hope I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. Around noon, my phone buzzed in my lap. Ben. I hesitated before answering. Hey, I said, voice raspy. Mama, where are you? His voice was tight with worry. We've been looking everywhere. I needed a minute. Rachel said, he paused. She said something happened. She's right. More silence. Do you want me to come get you? No, I said. I just need a little time. I hung up before he could argue. About an hour later, the sun high and warm, I walked back home. The house was quiet, too quiet. Ben and his family had gone to the hotel. Clara had left me a note. Call if you need anything, sugar. I'm right here. Rachel wasn't there. Neither was Thomas. I sat in the kitchen, peeled off the veil, and stared at the plate of untouched lemon bars someone had brought the night before. Muffin jumped onto the table, rubbed her head against my arm, and purred like nothing had changed. I envied her simplicity. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch with a glass of wine and waited. For answers, for grief, for anything that would soften the edges of what I now knew. Rachel came by the next morning. She stood on the porch in yesterday's clothes, her face pale, lips chewed raw. I'm sorry, she said. I looked at her, my daughter, the child I'd carried through every storm. No, you're not, I said softly. She blinked. Mama. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry I found out the way I did. But you're not sorry for loving him. She swallowed hard. I didn't mean for it to happen. I believe you. She stepped closer. Can we talk? Please. I opened the door just enough for her to come in. We sat in silence for a long while. Then she told me everything. How it started months ago. How she thought it was nothing. How he comforted her during a rough night. And they shared something they couldn't untangle. He made me feel seen, she said. I stared at her. And I didn't. She looked down. It's not about you. No, I said. But it is about choices. And you made one. She reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. Mama, she whispered. Please don't hate me. I looked out the window, eyes blurry with exhaustion. I don't hate you, I said. But I don't recognize you right now. That was the last thing I said before she left. And when the door clicked shut behind her, the silence returned like a guest I hadn't invited but couldn't turn away. Grief, my dear, doesn't always knock the wind out of you in one blow. Sometimes it drips in like a leaky faucet, steadily, insistently until the whole house floods. The days after the wedding that wasn't passed in a kind of waking dream. The flowers wilted in their vases, uneaten cake sat like an accusation in the fridge, and every corner of the house echoed with the absence of laughter. I moved through it like a ghost wearing a dress too pretty for mourning. Ben stayed an extra 2 nights. He didn't press me with questions, just hovered close, mowing the lawn, fixing a loose shutter, reading bedtime stories to his little ones with more gusto than usual. I'll be back for Mother's Day, he said softly before leaving. We'll go out to that diner you love. The one with the fried green tomatoes. I nodded. He kissed my forehead and left me standing on the porch with the sun behind him and goodbye in his eyes. Rachel didn't come back. Thomas didn't call. It was Clara who finally told me. She came over with chicken pot pie and her version of a condolence card. A bottle of Merlot and a few home-pressed handkerchiefs. I heard, she said, her voice low. Heard what? They're together. I didn't flinch. Didn't cry. I just stared at the pie. They left town, she added. Went up to Asheville, I think. Someone saw them checking into a little inn near the Biltmore. I nodded quietly. Clara reached across the table. Ellie, I don't know what to say. There's nothing to say. Then let me just sit with you a while. So she did. That night I pulled out the letters. Every card Thomas had ever written me. Every note tucked into borrowed books. Every thinking of you scribble on the backs of receipts. I read them all again, searching for cracks I hadn't seen. One note from the early days caught me. You remind me that life doesn't end at grief. That maybe, just maybe, spring can return even to old branches. I traced the words with my finger. And then I set them on fire. I burned every letter in the fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken, watching our love turn to ash. And then I sat back and breathed, for the first time in days. It wasn't relief. It wasn't closure. It was something closer to release. A surrender to the truth. That the people I loved most had chosen each other over me. I poured myself a drink. Not tea, not wine. Bourbon. I hadn't touched it since James died, but that night, it tasted like justice. Then I went upstairs, opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, and pulled out an old journal I hadn't written in for years. On the first page I wrote, April 22nd. Today I lost a man and a daughter in the same hour. And I am still breathing. I didn't know what the next pages would hold. But I knew they'd be mine. The following week passed in fragments. I woke early, even when I didn't want to. Made coffee I barely sipped. Sat on the porch in James's old rocking chair, muffin curled at my feet like nothing in the world had changed. I didn't tell many people. Not at first. Word got around the way it does in towns like ours. Quietly, sideways, with a side of speculation. Some folks stopped by under the guise of neighborly concern, bringing casseroles and pity like a bouquet I never asked to receive. Others avoided me altogether, as if heartbreak might be contagious. But the hardest part wasn't the gossip. It was the silence. The silence from Rachel. She didn't call. Didn't text. Didn't offer a single word to explain how we'd gotten here. At night, I'd lie in bed and remember when she was 5 and used to sleep with one arm slung around my neck, breathing that soft, hiccupy breath children have after a long cry. I'd always thought she'd come to me with everything. The first heartbreak, the disappointments, the fears. And she had. Until this. Now, the line between us felt so frayed I couldn't tell where forgiveness might begin. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Thursday, slipped through the mail slot in a plain envelope with no return address. The handwriting was hers, looped and familiar. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before opening it. Mama. I don't know how to say any of this. There's no version of it that won't make me the villain, and maybe I am. Maybe I've been lost for longer than I realized. What happened wasn't planned. I didn't look at Thomas and think, I want what my mother has. But somewhere in those late-night talks and kind words, something shifted. I felt seen. Not as your daughter, but as a woman again. I know what I've done. I see it on your face in my dreams. I hear it in the silence between us. I'm not asking for your blessing. I just didn't want to disappear without saying, I'm sorry. Love, Rachel. I read it once, then again, and the third time I read it aloud. It felt like tasting bitterness syllable by syllable. I folded it neatly, placed it in the drawer beside the sink, and poured myself another cup of cold coffee. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have words, but because there are moments when words become a kind of theft. When silence says more than a page ever could. That weekend, I packed up Thomas's things. The books he left in my study. The sweater he forgot on the coat hook. Even the honey jar, still unopened, from the market trip he made the week before everything broke. I placed them all in a box. Sealed it. Set it on the porch. I never mailed it. Never planned to. It wasn't about returning things. It was about reclaiming space. In the quiet days that followed, I found myself at the garden more. Digging, pruning, replanting what winter had worn down. There was something deeply human about pulling dead roots from the soil and making room for something new. One morning, I noticed my roses blooming again. Early, vivid, defiant. The same heirloom roses that should have adorned my wedding bouquet. And that's when I cried. Not for him. Not even for her. But for the part of me that still wanted to believe in love after everything. That afternoon, I wrote in my journal again. April 30th. I am beginning again. I do not know where this road leads. But I know now that I can walk it alone. Charleston wore its early May sun like silk, soft and golden, gently draping every street and shuttered window with the kind of light that made even old pain shimmer. But inside my house, the shadows lingered longer. Not from lack of sunshine, but from something quieter. A kind of emotional dusk. The days had grown steady again, but steadiness isn't the same as peace. I saw Thomas once. Not planned, not expected. Just one of those coincidences life throws at you to see if you've really healed. It was a Tuesday. I was at the market picking up fresh okra and peaches for a cobbler, humming a tune half under my breath, when I turned a corner by the bakery and there he was, paper bag under one arm, reading glasses perched low on his nose, scanning labels on a bottle of wine. He looked up, and we froze. His face, so familiar it ached, held a mix of apology and restraint. He stepped toward me, slow, like a man afraid to spook a deer. Ellie, he said quietly. I nodded. Thomas. He looked older. Just in the eyes. I didn't expect to see you here, he said. Didn't expect you'd still be in town. He shifted his weight, eyes flicking to the ring I wasn't wearing. I wanted to call. But you didn't. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Rachel's okay. I raised an eyebrow. Is that why you stopped me? To reassure me of her well-being? No, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I never meant for it to happen the way it did. I exhaled, slow and steady, holding the bag of peaches like an anchor. I believe you didn't mean to, I said. But meaning doesn't clean up what's broken. He looked down. You didn't deserve it. No, I said softly. But I survived it. He looked back up, and for a brief moment, the man I once loved, truly deeply, stood there in full. Not the one who betrayed me, just the one who made me believe again, even if only for a little while. Take care of her, I said. She's still my daughter. He nodded. I will. Then I walked away. Didn't look back. Didn't cry. Because sometimes mercy looks like letting someone go without a single backward glance. Back at home, I sat at the kitchen table and unpacked my groceries. As I held the okra in my hand, I thought about my mama's recipe, the one she used when my daddy left her, the one she said could cure a soul if you seasoned it right. That afternoon I cooked. For no one but myself. And when the house filled with the smell of spices in summer, I realized something quietly revolutionary. I was still here. Whole. Scarred. But still standing. And that mattered more than anything else they'd taken. That same week, I finally cleared the guest room. It had been Rachel's room since she moved back after her divorce. Then Thomas's, when he started spending nights under my roof instead of just on my porch. After everything happened, I'd kept the door shut like a room in mourning. But something shifted after that market encounter. Not out of anger, not even out of forgiveness, just a quiet urge to reclaim what had once been mine. I stripped the bed, opened the windows wide, let sunlight bleach the ghosts, boxed up the leftover sweaters, a forgotten hairbrush, even an old crossword puzzle Thomas had left half-finished on the nightstand. Each item went into a box labeled "to release." I didn't need to burn them. The letting go was happening in smaller, softer ways now. When I reached under the bed to pull out a shoebox I'd once used to store extra candles, my fingers brushed something unexpected, a photo. It was of me, Rachel, and Thomas. From that night at the jazz festival in Marion Square. We were laughing, arms around each other, the lights of the stage behind us like fireflies. I stared at it a long while. 3 people frozen in a lie that hadn't ripened yet. I slipped the photo into an old recipe book, tucked it on the top shelf, and told myself I'd decide later whether to keep it. That afternoon Ben called. "I've been thinking," he said, voice measured. "Why don't you come visit us for a while? The kids would love it. Just a change of scenery." I smiled. "That sounds lovely. I think I'd like that." He hesitated. "You sure you're okay?" I looked out the window at the garden. Roses blooming defiantly, the wind rustling the chimes James had hung there decades ago. "I'm getting there." He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for me. "We'll be here," he said. "Whenever you're ready." The next morning I packed a small suitcase. Not to run, not to escape, but to breathe somewhere new for a spell. I left the porch light on. Not for Rachel. Not for Thomas. For myself. A kind of beacon. Promise. Before I left, I stood one last time in the doorway of the guest room. Now empty, fresh, mine again. And I whispered something I hadn't yet said aloud. "I forgive you, but I don't forget. And that's how I keep what's left of me safe." Then I closed the door. Locked it not out of bitterness, but peace. Because the truth was simple and whole. What they broke could not be undone. But what they didn't take, that quiet resilience humming beneath my skin, was enough to begin again. There's a different kind of silence that comes when you leave home. Not the hollow quiet of heartbreak, but the calm hush of unfamiliar places, where the grief doesn't know your name yet. Ben's home outside Boston was full of life. The grandkids woke before the sun, bounding through the hallway like little comets. His wife, Miriam, greeted me each morning with strong coffee and a smile that never pushed. They knew not to ask too many questions. They simply let me be. A gift I didn't know I needed. The guest room overlooked a maple tree that was just beginning to bloom, and I took to sitting by the window every morning, wrapped in one of Miriam's knitted throws, journaling with the quiet determination of someone trying to reassemble their soul. I wrote about Charleston, about my garden, about the weight of wearing a wedding dress no one saw me walk down the aisle in. I wrote about Rachel, about the little girl she'd once been, about the woman she became. I wrote about Thomas too, but less often. Mostly, I wrote about myself. About the pieces of me I'd forgotten in the wake of love and loss. About the parts still worth loving, even when no one else was watching. One morning, Ben sat beside me on the back porch, 2 mugs of coffee between us. "You seem lighter," he said, not looking directly at me. "I think I am," I replied. "Grief doesn't always go away. Sometimes it just finds a new pocket to live in." He nodded, tapping his fingers on his cup. "You know, Rachel reached out." I turned to him, my body still, my voice steady. "When?" "A few days ago. She asked how you were." I sipped my coffee. And what did you say? I told her you were healing. That you were writing again. That you weren't strong. I looked out at the yard, where the kids were chasing each other with sticks and giggles. She asked if I wanted to hear from her. Ben hesitated. She said she'd understand if you didn't. But she misses you. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't feel something, but because I felt too much. That night, alone in the guest room, I pulled out the letter Rachel had written me. The one I'd tucked into the side pocket of my suitcase like a thorn I wasn't ready to throw away. I read it again, but this time with a softer heart. Not because what she did hurt any less, but because I no longer wanted to live at the edge of that pain. Not forever. I pulled out my journal and wrote a single line beneath the date. There is space inside me for sorrow, and still room for grace. The next morning I took a walk alone. Ben's neighborhood curved gently, all red brick and tall trees. The kind of suburb where children's chalk drawings decorate the sidewalks and wind chimes sing from porches. It was a different world from Charleston, quieter, less humid, without the ghosts of old love trailing your every step. I walked slowly, one hand tucked into my coat, the other trailing over hedges and fence posts like I was trying to feel something through my fingertips. Halfway through the block I found a tiny park. Just a swing set, a single bench and a stone path that led to nowhere in particular. I sat there for a long time watching nothing in particular, letting the breeze tangle my hair. That's when I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I prayed. Not a loud, eloquent plea. Not a desperate sob. Just a quiet murmur from deep in my ribs. Help me let go. Not for them. For me. I didn't need to forgive all at once. I didn't even need to forget. But I did need to move. Because grief, if left too long, hardens into identity. And I refused to be just the woman left at the altar by her own daughter. I wanted to be more than that. Back at the house I sat down with Miriam while the kids napped. She poured tea, as if she already knew I needed something gentle. Did you love him? She asked softly, not as a probe but as a friend. I did, I said. Not in the way I loved James. But enough to believe again. And your daughter? I paused. I still do. That's what makes it harder. Miriam nodded, her hands wrapped around her cup. You don't stop loving your child. But sometimes you have to love them from far away. Her words sank into me like warm bread, filling and tender. I realized then that loving Rachel didn't mean erasing the betrayal. It didn't mean inviting her back into the same place in my heart. It simply meant acknowledging she was still part of me, just not in the same way. That night I sat by the window and wrote a letter. Not to Rachel. To myself. Dear Eleanor. You survived the kind of heartbreak people write novels about. You kept breathing when it felt like the air had been stolen from the room. You let yourself hope and you dared to love again. That is not weakness. That is courage in its truest form. You are not what happened to you. You are what you choose next. I folded the letter and slipped it between the pages of my journal. And when I turned off the light, I didn't lie awake for the first time in weeks. I slept. Coming home felt different this time. Not because the house had changed, it hadn't. The hydrangeas still bloomed defiantly by the gate. Muffin still watched the birds from the kitchen window like it was her full-time job. And the porch creaked in all the same places. But I was different. Or maybe just more myself than I'd been in a long while. The door clicked shut behind me with a softness that no longer hurt. I walked through each room like I was meeting it again for the first time. Not with dread, but with a cautious sort of gratitude. The kind that comes after a storm, when you realize the walls still stand and the roof still holds. I unpacked slowly. Not just the suitcase from Boston, but everything I'd been carrying in my chest. The next morning, I brewed a fresh pot of tea, trimmed a few wild rose branches in the garden, and sat on the porch with my journal. I wrote down everything I was ready to release. The wedding dress. The silence from Rachel. The memory of Thomas's hand on her cheek. The image of my own heartbreak, waiting at the altar like a woman who hadn't read the ending. Then I flipped the page and wrote what I wanted to claim. Peace. The strength to move forward. My own damn joy. That afternoon I did something bold. I called Rachel. The line rang 3 times before she picked up. She sounded breathless, surprised. Mama. I don't have long, I said gently. I just wanted to tell you something. She was quiet. I'm home. I've been away, but I'm home now. And I'm okay. More silence. I'm not calling to reopen anything, I added. I just thought you should know I'm finding my footing again. Her voice came soft, like a child's. I think about you every day. I nodded, even though she couldn't see. I believe you. I don't expect anything. Not now. Not after. I know. Do you hate me? She asked. My heart tensed. No, I said. But I think I needed the silence to understand what kind of love I can offer you now. She sniffled. Even if I never deserve it. Love isn't about deserving, I said. But trust? That's a different story. I could hear her crying softly. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't cry with her. I have to go, I said gently. But I hope you're well. Mama. Goodbye, Rachel. I hung up, set the phone down, and took the deepest breath I'd taken in months. I'd said what needed saying.
No fireworks. No dramatic ending.
Just truth. Steady and full. The days that followed were quiet, but they weren't empty. I moved through them with intention, replanted the garden bed near the porch, started rereading my favorite Toni Morrison novels, baked cinnamon bread and left a loaf on Clara's doorstep. I even let Delilah convince me to attend a jazz night at the community center, where a local quartet played something slow, an aching that stirred the dust in my bones. I didn't dress up. I didn't need to. I wore my soft blue cardigan, the one James used to say brought out my eyes, and I let the music do what it does best. Reach the places that words often can't. After the set, an older gentleman with silver hair and a walking cane asked if I'd like to join his table for coffee. His name was Walter. He'd been a widower for 12 years. Taught American history at the university. Still wrote poetry in the margins of old newspapers. We talked for 2 hours. Not about love. Not about heartbreak. About music. About how Charleston had changed. About the way grief rewires your sense of time. When he walked me to my car, he didn't ask for my number. Just tipped his hat and said, "If our paths cross again, I'd be glad for it." And that was enough. It reminded me that connection didn't always have to lead somewhere. Sometimes it could just exist for the sake of existing. That night, I came home and found a letter waiting on my porch. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Mama, I'm moving to Asheville full-time. Thomas got a job offer, and I need space too. Not from you, but from who I was here. I understand if you never want to see me again. I do. But if you ever feel ready, I'll always answer when you call. Love. Rachel. I sat with the letter a long time. Then I folded it gently, placed it in the same recipe book where I'd tucked that photograph months earlier, and closed the cover. I didn't cry. Instead, I made a cup of tea, walked out to the porch, and watched the stars appear one by one. It occurred to me then, I didn't need Rachel to come back the same. I didn't need her to undo what she'd done. I just needed her to reckon with it. And maybe she finally had. As for me, I was no longer waiting, no longer holding my breath for what might return, because I had returned. To myself. To my home. To a version of peace I thought I'd lost forever. The first letter I ever wrote to James after he passed wasn't written until that summer. It had been 8 years since his death, and still, grief sometimes curled around me like a scarf I didn't ask to wear. But something about walking through the storm with Rachel and Thomas had brought his memory into sharper focus. Not the loss of him. The presence. That Saturday morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh sheet of stationery. The same kind I used when we were first married. I poured a cup of Earl Grey, lit a gardenia-scented candle, and began. Dear James, you would have told me to trust my gut. You always did. And I ignored it. Thought I was just being overprotective, too cautious. But you were right. Intuition is a kind of wisdom we shouldn't explain away. I wish you could have met Thomas. Not because you'd have liked him, but because you'd have known. You always saw people clearer than I did. You had that truth-teller kind of sight. But I'm all right now. I truly am. It's a quiet kind of all right. Like the way morning light spills through the curtains when no one's awake yet. I loved him, James. Not like I loved you. But I opened myself again, and I'm proud of that. I needed to remember that I'm still capable of joy. And Rachel, our girl, is walking her own hard road. I don't know if she'll come back, but I think she's starting to find herself again. Not the daughter I raised, maybe, but a woman shaped by fire. I just hope the fire doesn't burn everything down. Anyway, I just wanted to tell you I'm still here. Still writing. Still planting roses. Still putting one foot in front of the other. And sometimes, I still talk to you. I hope you still hear me. Love always. Ellie. I folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and tucked it into the drawer where I kept the old photo albums. It didn't need to be mailed. It had already done its work. Later that week, I got a card in the mail. No message, no return address. Just a photograph of the Blue Ridge Mountains and the words, "Thinking of you," written in Rachel's handwriting. I didn't call. Didn't write back. But I took the card and pinned it to the corkboard above my writing desk. Not as a promise. Not as a wound. Just as a reminder that somewhere out there, the thread between us hadn't broken entirely. It had stretched. Gnarled. But not snapped. And sometimes that was enough. By late August, the roses had come back fuller than I expected. Almost defiant in their beauty, as if the garden itself had decided I'd suffered enough. I spent most mornings outside, trimming, deadheading, whispering things to the petals I'd never admit aloud. Plants, like people, bloom better when spoken to with tenderness. One afternoon, Clara came by with a peach pie and a flyer. "Thought you might like this," she said, waving the paper in front of me. It was for a memoir writing workshop at the local library. 6 weeks, Tuesday evenings, limited to 10 women over 50. "It's time," she said. "For what?" "To tell your story. For real this time." I laughed, but it caught in my throat. "I've already been writing." "Yes, but now you need witnesses." There was something holy in that phrase, "you need witnesses." I signed up. And on the first night, I sat in a circle of women with soft hands and lined faces, each one holding some version of their own heartbreak. One had buried a child. One had survived cancer. One had fled a marriage that left bruises in places you couldn't see. We shared. We listened. We cried sometimes. And slowly, word by word, I began to shape the story that had nearly undone me. But this time, I wasn't writing from the center of the wound. I was writing from the edge of healing. At the third session, I read aloud a piece I titled "The Chapel Door." It was about the moment I stepped outside, bouquet in hand, veil catching in the breeze, and chose myself over ceremony. When I finished reading, the room was silent. Then someone clapped. And soon they all did. It wasn't applause for survival. It was recognition. Afterward, one of the women came up to me, tears still in her eyes. "You said something I couldn't say myself," she whispered. "Thank you." I hugged her. Not because I was whole, but because I was whole enough to hold someone else's story alongside my own. That night, I walked home under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled light across it. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, looked up, and smiled. I was not the woman who had been left. I was the woman who had remained. And that, my dear, was more powerful than I'd ever imagined. A few weeks ago, I got another letter. No name on the envelope this time, but I knew the handwriting the moment I saw it. Inside was a short note, folded around a photo. The note read, "Mama, I'm still learning how to live with the choices I made. But I wanted you to have this. It's not a peace offering. Just a piece of the truth. I love you. Even when I didn't show it. Even when I hurt you. Rachel." The photo was of us. Not from the wedding week, not from any official family portrait, but an old snapshot I didn't even remember being taken. I was holding Rachel when she was about 6, barefoot in the garden, both of us laughing, dirt smudged on our cheeks. Her arms were wrapped around my neck, and my eyes, God, my eyes were so full of her. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't cry. I just smiled. Quietly, like someone remembering the way the sun used to feel. I placed the photo on my mantle, beside one of James, and one of Ben's little ones at Christmas. That's the thing about healing. It's not loud. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or finish lines. It tiptoes in while you're living, while you're planting, writing, folding laundry. It sits beside you in the dark and waits until you're ready to light the candle again. And when it does, you realize you've made a home inside yourself. One no betrayal can ever evict. One where love, even love that nearly broke you, still blooms in unexpected places. If at 64, I said yes to love, until my future husband left me for my daughter minutes before the vows opened something quiet in your soul, my dear, I'd love to know what stayed with you. Leave me a note below, share it with someone who might be walking the same road. And subscribe if you'd like to sit for another tale one day soon. Some stories don't come to heal us. They come to remind us we're still here. And that, my dear, is a mighty powerful thing.